Okay, it is the noon hour, a couple minutes past. This is Gonzalo Garcia from SPG Life and Annuity, and we are thrilled to have a conversation with you all about the $2 million exemption opportunity that came out of the One Big Beautiful Bill Act of last year, which is very timely and presents huge opportunities for us. Today with me, I've got Ann Hagerty, JD, and RICP from Securian Financial. She is the Director of Advanced Sales. Ann practiced, excuse me, Ann practiced law and private practice for 10 years before joining Securian in 2021. And she is an authority on estate planning, elder law, and asset protection. So we're going to let Ann kick off the first part of this webinar, and then I will take it after that. But just a couple of housekeeping items. We will be taking questions mostly along the way, but we will leave time for Q&A at the end. There is a Q&A box at the bottom of your screen or a chat box. If you would put your questions in the Q&A box, that would be preferred because we only have to monitor one of them. So Q&A in the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. We are looking forward to this webinar. Thank you all for attending on behalf of SPG Life and Annuity. And Ann, the floor is yours. Thank you for being with us.
All right, awesome. Thank you so much, Gonzalo. So we're talking about this $2 million opportunity. I do just want to kick off that, some of your clients may have already used their lifetime exemption, which we'll get into in great detail, but some may have not. So there are larger opportunities even for those clients who have not yet used their gift exemption amounts. So let's kind of dive in to the history of gift and estate tax. So over the last 25 years, the estate tax exemption has moved from under $1 million, so $675,000 in 2001, which isn't that terribly long ago, right? And it has moved from $5 million to over $13 million, and now this year in 2026 to $15 million per person. So for a married couple, that would be $30 million for a couple. And this has not been a straight line, right? This has been a moving target. And each of these changes has been driven not by planning, but often by politics. So different administrations and different priorities have created a very different outcome for clients. But what history consistently tells us is that high exemptions may not stay high forever. Even recently, at the end of 2025, we were preparing for a drop to roughly $7 million per person almost overnight under Tax Cuts and Jobs Act with the sunset. So while today's environment is favorable, it may not be permanent, and it is simply a snapshot in time. And that is exactly why today and this moment matters. Clients who have already done planning and already potentially used their exemption previously have just been given another rare opportunity to use additional exemption amounts. The One Big Beautiful Bill Act created an additional $2 million of exemption capacity per person that can be used, locked in, and protected from future changes. So the question is really not whether the law will change again. The question is what we do with this window right now. And right now is the most...
And can I just interrupt you one quick
Yeah.
second? I'm sorry to do this because you were kind of on a roll, but you mentioned people who have used their $28 million exemption. If they haven't used any of their exemption, and I know you're going to talk a little bit about that later, but let's not make this, and this was us, right? We put the title out there on $2 million, but that's the new gifting that we have in addition to the 28 that may or may not have already been used. So I think we're in a great opportunity right now to really highlight the issue of gifting. I believe we're in probably the heyday of estate planning because of such a large gift presents such amazing opportunities. And so many people thought that, with this new One Big Beautiful Bill Act, and, there's such a small percentage of people that have estate tax problems now, but it's not about the estate tax. It's about the gift tax and the gift tax opportunity or the gifting opportunity. So I'm sorry to have interrupted. I wanted to kind of throw that in there because I think it's a great opportunity to be talking about this.
Yep, absolutely. So right now, you're absolutely correct. Right now is the most favorable gift tax allowance that we've ever had in history. So it does present an opportunity for clients who have not done any planning, as well as clients that have previously used part of their exemption towards that gifting and now have an additional capacity to consider. So great call out, kind of looking at historical numbers that we've seen kind of in the last 25 years.
Yeah.
So the exemption has increased roughly 22 times over the past 25 years. And importantly, that volatility has occurred under both political parties. So it reinforces that key point that this number is ever changing and may not be permanent, right? But what we know is that the current $15 million exemption exists because of a specific Congress and a specific administration. And a future Congress could just as easily reduce it. In fact, given the current fiscal environment, the long-term pressure likely points to potentially lower exemptions or just general tax changes, not higher ones. And so we almost saw that happen in real time with the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act sunset that I mentioned earlier. But here's what's fundamentally important in these planning conversations, and that is the anti-clawback rule, right? So if a client uses today's higher exemption and Congress later reduces that exemption, those prior gifts are protected. So acting today doesn't just take advantage of the current law, it locks that benefit in permanently. And then
Great
if you're looking,
opportunity.
we're going to say something, Gonzalo?
Yeah, that's a great opportunity.
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah.
At the end of the day, the planning decision is really simple, right? So it comes down to one question. Can the client afford to give this money away permanently and irrevocably, right? So if the answer is yes, absolutely, you're acting now, right? You're using that exemption, you're funding the trust, using that gifting capacity, and you're locking in the planning benefit that it can provide. If the answer is, I'm not sure, and I might need access to the assets, that's where tools like spousal limited lifetime access trusts can come in. And you still complete the gift, right? But you preserve indirect access through the spouse, creating that flexibility without losing the tax benefit. And that's one of the case studies that Gonzalo is going to show us in a little bit. And if the answer is a hard no, right? The client is saying, I need my money, I can't gift it away right now, then we stop, right? And the strategy only works if the assets are truly a surplus to the client's lifestyle. And trying to force an irrevocable strategy on a client where that doesn't fit doesn't make sense. And in those scenarios, there are still other opportunities to potentially lock in insurability for the client without necessarily gifting that life insurance policy now, but with the framework that you might want to take advantage of that in the future. So let's talk a little bit about the unified gift and estate tax system. One of the most important technical concepts here is that the gift and estate tax are unified. So for lack of a better word, they're married to each other. So there's only one lifetime exemption that addresses both the gift and estate tax system. So when I think about this unified system, what I think about is you either give away assets during your life, which is what we're talking about today, or you have the exemption that's available to you at death, which could be different in the future. So every dollar that you use during your life reduces what remains at death. And this is why lifetime gifting tends to win. When you gift an asset today, you're not just removing the current value, you're removing all of the future appreciation from the estate. And that's the real benefit of acting today versus waiting until you die to capitalize on that estate tax exemption that is married to the gift tax exemption. And the upside is everything that grows outside of the taxable estate from the point forward. So the earlier the gift is made, the greater the long-term transfer benefit is. A few other notes here is that there is also an annual exclusion. So that's the $19,000 per donee, the recipient who receives the gift, that can be given to anyone in any given year without impacting that unified credit that we discussed. And this is typically indexed for inflation. It wasn't in 2026, but annually it usually goes up by about $1,000. So if you're married, that's ×2 to anyone you want to gift to, but it doesn't impact that unified credit. So if a client uses amounts above the $19,000 per person or per recipient per year in a state tax return, a gift tax return, Form 706 is required to tell the IRS what amount of the current unified credit is used. So that's how some clients get concerned about that and say, well, then I have to file a gift tax return. It doesn't mean that you owe taxes. It means that you're telling the IRS this is the amount of the unified credit that I've used to this point in time.
Hey, Ann, there's
Yeah.
a question on on the Q&A. Any changes to individual state estate taxes?
Yeah, so
There's like 17 states or so that have an inheritance or an estate tax or both. So
yep.
can you address some of the changes that's going on at the state level?
Yeah, so we've seen certain states kind of follow the federal, gift exemption. Like, for example, Connecticut follows whatever the federal amount is, and other states also follow that. We also saw previously Iowa had an inheritance tax that they repealed at the end of 2025. So, other than that, most of them have stayed pretty static. We have 15 states, including DC, in there that have an actual estate tax. And then we have 5 other states that have gift or inheritance tax. So
Yeah.
it's really important to kind of follow what state your clients lived in to see whether they have issues, maybe not at the federal level, but also at the state level, and try to capitalize on that. So,
And there are some states with fairly low exemptions.
yep,
So even then, we'll talk about that in our case study. But yeah, there's states like New York which have a cliff over
yep.
7 something million dollars. That anything over that, it goes back to the fullest estate tax for the state of New York. And there's a few other states like Maryland and Massachusetts and Oregon and so on that have
Yes.
pretty meaningful estate taxes and low exemptions. So something
Yes,
to be mindful of.
absolutely. So I'm really lucky because I live in one of those states, which is Minnesota, where we have a $3 million exemption per person.
Yeah.
And I think that kind of brings us to our next topic, which is portability. So there are kind of two key structural rules that shape estate planning, and that's portability, which allows the surviving spouse to use a deceased spouse's unused exemption. So this is an example where if you have a married couple and one of them passes away but didn't necessarily use their gift tax exemption during their lifetime, their spouse can capitalize on that by timely filing that Form 706 to tell the IRS, my spouse has passed away, but I want to capitalize on that estate tax exemption that still exists for them. And portability is specifically limited within most states. So, for example, here in Minnesota, there's a $3 million exemption per person at the state level. Above that amount, there is a state estate tax. If you have a married couple with traditional planning where one person dies and everything goes to their spouse, which is typical, there's no portability in most states. So the only 2 states that have portability are Hawaii and Maryland. And remember, Maryland is one of those states that has not only an estate tax, it also has an inheritance tax. So kind of duly limited in Maryland. So for those clients, especially on the East Coast, and then looking at Oregon and Washington, have those low exemption amounts, but they also can't use portability. So if they don't do very specific planning, that portability or that exemption is essentially lost. That's a $3 million in Minnesota tax benefit that now, if you've not done planning, is lost to the clients. And looking at this portability concept, it doesn't just remove future appreciation, right? So the unlimited marital deduction is also important in thinking about this concept. So assets can pass to a surviving spouse with no estate tax, and that's great, but it doesn't eliminate the tax as we're showing here, right? It defers it. So it ultimately means that the estate tax problem lands at second death if there's no portability in that state, or they have not timely filed with the IRS to use that unused exemption. And that's why if you look at life insurance, generally those survivorship policies often fit so well, right? It aligns exactly with when the tax liability occurs, which is often at that second death. And that's why we use these types of vehicles like SLATs for access and gifting, irrevocable life insurance trusts for insurance ownership, to kind of do some of that planning now and making sure we're capitalizing on portability, whether that's federally or in the state that they live in. And other advanced techniques also exist if planning requires that with more complex estates. So when you're thinking about using this gift exemption, which is what we hope that you will consider, from the perspective of working with clients and talking to clients about this, is the gift has to be properly completed. So that's a really important point when you're looking at a valid gift. Did I, complete the gift to a trust or to someone else in order to capitalize on this gift exemption. So first, it must be irrevocable. So the client cannot retain control. So I can't say, well, Gonzalo, I like you. I'm going to give you $1 million, but I'm going to keep it in my account, or I'm going to keep it in my name, and you can call me and you can use this $1 million whenever you feel like it, right? So that's not a completed gift because I still retain access. And so this is why when you're doing planning with slats or eyelets, you want to be really careful that you have not retained control somehow those assets through the language of the trust, because then that gift is not completed. And second, when you look at the IRS sections 2036 and through 2038, they really look at that retained control, that incidence of ownership or things like that, to see whether that gift is actually completed. If I can go back into the trust and take money out, then the IRS can audit that and say, well, you haven't actually completed the gift. Even though you've put it in an irrevocable trust, maybe you still retained access. And then third, there has to be an actual delivery, right? The assets have to fully transfer to the trust or whoever you're giving the gift to. And from an execution standpoint, Form 709 documents that gift today, right? So you're looking at telling the IRS that you've completed the gift, and it doesn't necessarily mean any taxes due. It just means that you're letting the IRS know that you've used part of your unified credit above that $19,000 per person annually that you have that's really outside of all of this. So when we layer in life insurance through an irrevocable life insurance trust, the trust is going to own that policy. The insured is not the owner of the policy, right? Because if they were, then now they still retain control. And then at death, that benefit, that tax-free death benefit for the life insurance, is going to stay outside of the estate. And that's really important. We want to avoid also the 3-year rule, which is a 3-year look back that says if an existing policy that is gifted, but then the original grantor, the person who gave the gift, dies within 3 years, then that policy or that asset can be brought back into the original donor's estate, essentially. And so we want to make sure that we do this early when the client is healthy and insurable, and not when it's a last minute situation where all of a sudden this client is saying, oh my gosh, I have an estate tax issue, but I'm sick and I'm terminally ill and I am unable to complete the gift at this point because of that 3-year look back. So I know, Gonzalo, you've probably experienced this through your work. And I've also had calls where the client is, elderly, maybe they're ill and they're worried about this estate tax now. And it's really, really hard to fix those issues at that point in time because we don't have these vehicles and exemptions available to us in the same way.
Yeah, the whole concept of deathbed gifting is just problematic for
Yeah.
sure. And there are some carriers, not that you're going to get offers on somebody who's, on their deathbed, but there are some carriers that have some riders that protect against that exposure for the first 3 or 4 years. So, and they can either,
Yes.
you got, I think Securian has it. I know a number of
Yes, we
others,
do.
but they're definitely something to consider as part of the issuance of a second and die policy.
Yep, so that's called an estate preservation rider, and it typically is going to address that 3-year look back if the client can, be underwritten for insurance and they also may pass away because of age or other factors. In that
Right.
3-year look back, you can, incorporate protective measures in those situations, but still the best type of planning is early and, really having that control and thinking about what that gift does and making sure it works for its intended purpose. So absolutely. I want to talk a little bit now about the anti-clawback rule. So this is something that is really, really important as you think about why you would gift today versus using that exemption at death. So the anti-clawback rule says that if a client makes a gift using today's higher exemption and the exemption is later reduced, that prior gift is not pulled back into the estate. So what this means is if I decide to gift my $15 million that I have available today, but then, say 5-10 years from now, they reduce that exemption amount down to 10 or 5, they can't come back under my estate and say, well, you gave too much, because I had that anti-clawback rule working for me where they said at the time you gave the gift, you had that allowance. And so the gift is completed. We want to make sure it's a valid gift and that benefit is locked in for the client. And this does, really two critical things and makes that planning permanent, right? So that's really important for a lot of our clients is that they can complete these gifts, they can do the planning today, and they can sit back and relax knowing that they have liquidity for paying estate taxes, for legacy planning, without the concern that someday somebody's going to come back to them and say, well, we've changed the law now and this no longer applies. So the risk today is really not acting because protection applies to the clients who use the exemption, not the ones who wait to see what happens. And looking a little bit at carryover basis. So this is an important concept. So you might be listening to this and thinking about gifting just generally, right? So you could give $15 million of cash, you could give $15 million of assets, but it's important to acknowledge and consider why life insurance particularly is so important in these planning conversations, because when you gift assets, particularly appreciated assets, the recipient takes carryover basis. So I said before, I like Gonzalo, right? So I decide, I'm going to give Gonzalo my home, right? Maybe I paid $100,000 for my home. Don't I wish, right? And then someday when Gonzalo goes to sell that house, he says, thanks, Ann. I love it. Now that I've passed away and maybe I'm no longer in the home, he takes control of the home and decides to sell it. Maybe that home is now worth $500,000. Now what's happened is he's exposed himself to $400,000 of capital gains potential. And so you have to be really careful when you think about what assets you're gifting, because whenever you gift an asset, the basis you have in that asset carries over to the recipient. And that means unrealized capital gains carry forward. In contrast, assets that are highly appreciated, held until death. So if I wait to give Gonzalo my house until I die, he gets a step up in basis on that home of the $500,000. So he goes to sell it. There's no built-in gain with that transaction. And so gifting reduces the estate tax. Like we said, it moves it outside of the estate so it can continue to appreciate, but it could create future income tax exposure kind of for those clients who gives particular assets. And I've seen this with, different financial professionals over time who don't really think about what assets they're using to gift. And that's why life insurance is uniquely powerful, right? Because it's going to address both sides. It's going to allow you to gift, to remove assets from your estate using cash that you use to fund the trust. And that trust is going to purchase a life insurance policy, which is leveraged, right? So it's going to give a greater death benefit. And that death benefit then is going to be tax-free. And then stepping back, just looking as of January 1, 2026, clients who have already used their prior exemption now have an additional $2 million. So that's what this is all about, is really looking at clients who may have already done this planning. Go them, right? So they've done the proactive planning, but they have an additional opportunity now, right? Because they have another $2 million right now under One Big Beautiful Bill Act. And for a married couple, that means an additional $4 million, right? So we've really covered the legal framework to look at kind of the volatility, historical volatility of this exemption, and the permanence that we have capitalized on with the anti-clawback rule, and the decision-making framework as you're working with clients to think about whether they're a good candidate to do additional gifting. So what is the most effective way to actually deploy this additional $2 million for these clients who may have previously used their $28 million or $14 million if they're a single individual? There's really kind of three options here if you think about it. So they could say, I'm not doing any gifting today. I'm keeping everything in my estate and I'm risking that exposure in the future if things change. I can gift assets to the trust. Maybe they're investment assets, stocks, real estate, different things. With that, we talked about that carryover basis concern. And then last, but definitely not least, is, gifting to the trust using life insurance as that vehicle. And so at this point, I think it's a great segue to turn things over to Gonzalo to walk through kind of the numbers and a real world case that he worked on that show how these strategies really work.
Well, Anne, I love the fact that you're going to make a bunch of gifts to me personally.
Yes,
and I'm so happy to take your house and your $1 million gift. So thank you for that. I really appreciate it.
Yes, absolutely. We'll have to talk after this. Remember, it's not a gift doesn't make a contract though, so we're still good.
You got to have to file your 709, right? Exactly. We'll
Yes.
be good until then. Well, and thank you. That's a great segue to kind of the numbers, right? So we've kind of talked about all the theory and all the issues and why this is such a meaningful opportunity because, I think to Ann's point is if I already made a $28 million gift, let's say husband and wife made their $28 million gift, or even if they haven't, but we're just going to continue to operate our case study here under the assumption that they have already made their $28 million gifting and that they have $2 million each on a forward basis, right? So, to Ann's point earlier, what do you do with that $2 million? Her first slide said, or her second or third slide said, look, if you don't need the money, you should absolutely consider making a $2 million gift today. If you may need the money, consider a slat.
Yep.
If you absolutely need the money, don't make a gift, right? Full stop, right?
Yep.
So what we did, and this was a case we recently worked on, and I just kind of run you through the numbers. So we had a 60-year-old and a 58-year-old. They had about $50 million in total assets. They had made previously $28 million gifts. So there's two slats, one for each, with $14 million plus some growth in it. So they had already made $28 million of gifts, and they got this new $2 million of gifting opportunity now in January of 2026 when the One Big Beautiful Bill Act kicked in for the $2 million exemption increase. So they still had significant assets in their taxable estate. They had almost no exemption left for estate planning purposes. So they still had a big big estate tax problem. They were both insurable and they were both legacy focused, right? They were focused on how do we move assets to the next generation and the following generation and so on to make sure that our assets are preserved as best possible. So if you could just kind of go to that next slide. So here's what the way we tee up this case. So let's say we keep the $2 million in the estate. The $2 million continues to grow at 7%. This was a Maryland case, but I will tell you that, and Maryland has a 16% state estate tax and on top of the 40% federal. So it doesn't quite add up to 56 because you get a deduction from one for the other. So our combined estate tax is 49.6. Assets will continue to grow, so will the tax bill. There's really no leverage, no tax-free exit, but they do get a step up in basis, right? So that $2 million grows to $5 million, the kids inherit, they get a $5 million basis, and then they can sell that asset capital gains tax-free, right? If they sell it the next day with no further appreciation. So we looked at kind of that scenario, and we looked at age 85, and after taxes and so on, the heirs would get $17.2 million. So between 68, 58, all the way to 85, second death, the assets grew to $17.2 million after the taxes due and so on. Okay?
Yeah. And I think I'll just add one thing here.
Mhm.
If you think about your clients and why they do or do not do something, right? So maybe you're talking Roth conversions or you're talking other, optionality in their portfolio to say, how do we get more, tax-free assets built in there? A lot of times the paralyzing moment is taxes. But if you look at this number, 49.6% of their potential estate goes to the government, the state they live in, the federal government. They would say no to that, right? So I think a lot of this is also about education, understanding what the actual figures are, what the impact of this is to their estate. I think if you position it that way, you can get clients to think about that, because the reason they don't want their RMDs or the reason they don't want to take money out of their qualified accounts is because of taxes,
Yeah.
right? They don't
Yeah.
want to pay more in taxes, but by maybe being paralyzed, now they've created a huge exposure that they could have never imagined. So I'll
Well,
move on to the next slide here.
and as you see the comparison, you really begin to see that difference, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
So the next thing that we look at, and by the way, SPG's Advanced Markets team has built kind of a whole financial model with all of our inputs and all the things that we're talking about here, and we can help you guys run cases and look at these three options to make sure that your clients are making the best decision possible for their situation and, of course, for their family. So, and some of the numbers and some of the outputs here are coming from that system. So let's consider the fact that, okay, I don't need the money and I'm willing to make a gift. So you can make a gift to a trust and just you retitle the asset, complete your gift tax return, and you then invest the money in the same investments that you had while you owned it in your estate, right? So you've got some managed portfolio, and it also grows at 7%. There's no estate tax on those assets, but the heirs will pay a capital gain tax because they will lose their step up in basis at death. We're using 24% here. Again, Maryland has a hefty capital gains tax. By the way, we ignored the NIIT tax and net investment income tax on all these scenarios. So we're not jacking up by another 3.8%. But we could. We could include that, would make it look worse. So what you're doing here is you're really trading off an estate tax for a capital gains tax. So you're going from kind of 49.6 to 24, right? So the assets basically grow the same way. They grow to the exact same amount, but because you traded off that 40 for a 24% tax, the heirs get $23.5 million. And that's a huge benefit, right? You're pushing $6 million more to the kids or grandkids or generationally. And that is a big win. So that kind of shows the power of making the gift today, getting that asset out of the estate, and getting all of the future growth and compounding on those assets out of the estate forever, right? And any comment on that?
No, I think that's a good call out, right? If you look at this slide, it's certainly better than the previous one.
Yeah.
But it's just considering really the vehicle that you're using for the gifting in terms of that carryover basis and really thinking about, does that create another impact? And I think it comes down to that scenario where you say like, hey, Gonzalo, can I do better than that, right? So you're kind
Yeah,
of looking at these scenarios in that way, almost like a game show, right? Okay, we have this
exactly.
scenario. What's better than that? Okay, and this
Right.
is that trajectory. And I think,
Exactly.
capital gains are certainly more favorable than that 49.6% potential state tax for this family, right? But there's still a better alternative.
Yeah, yeah, for sure. And then obviously we go to strategy number three, which is, make the gift, make the $2 million gift, leverage that $2 million gift with insurance. Now, keep in mind, this couple, this case study, they had $14 million in each slat plus, and it was only investments. They had not bought insurance yet, right? And so that extra $2 million was now going into either a separate trust or the slat if it allowed for insurance. Some do, some don't. That gets back to drafting. But in this case, a new trust was set up. $2 million went into that trust, and we used 5 annual withdrawals of 400 grand. We left some residual investment income in the trust for if we needed later or whatever, but just some liquidity. So we took the 2 million, paid 5 premiums of $400,000, and that bought almost $12 million of life insurance on a second to die basis. So what you're really doing now is taking that $2 million and giving it the step up in basis, right? Because the death proceeds are both income tax and estate tax free because they're in the trust. And you also create an environment where if God forbid something happened to them earlier, there's just a massive amount of leverage. So, there's real benefits to creating an insurance trust in combination with gifting. And that is it's because of the power of the insurance, right? So I think we've got a comparison right after this, where we show kind of year by year, the advantage of strategy 3, which is the gifting plus insurance, as opposed to gifting versus investment or keeping it in the estate. And you can see that the insurance advantage is massive in the early years, and it goes down, right? The investments eventually start to catch up, but you got to get to past 95 for it to cross over. And that is a really powerful bet that the family is making to say, am I going to have the certainty of a 7% compounded annual year-over-year return? Could be way more than that on average. You may have up years, down years, but here's the beauty of life insurance. It doesn't care what the markets are doing the day you die, right? It is completely uncorrelated to the rest of the markets. It is fully liquid the day you die, exactly when you need it, because state taxes are due in 9 months, right? And so it does, and then there's no for sale of assets. So you've got a massive amount of liquidity in this trust to deal with anything that's going on in the markets, and it's available dollar for dollar, fully liquid the next day. And that is the power of combining insurance with gifting strategies in a trust. So you can see the advantages of why use insurance. Now, I think, Ann, the next one is kind of a line graph. There you go. So, 21, 4, 30 million, 34 million, that's at age 90. You can look at 85, you can look at 95, but you see the green line, it doesn't cross over until after age 95. And I think that that is a huge planning opportunity for you all for this extra $2 million of gifting that has been given to us by the One Big Beautiful Bill Act. Somebody on the David Appel asked, do we have a pre-built data gathering form to run this analysis? The answer is yes. We have the inputs that you would need. So, David, happy to chat with you after this call, and we can talk about that. If you have any questions about kind of the outputs and all that kind of stuff, that I'm happy to have a one-on-one conversation with anybody on the call. And let's begin to wrap this up, and we'll take any additional questions that the group may have. So, what I talk about really here is, do you have certainty? And it certainly goes back to certain things, like even things that Ann mentioned. No clawback, right? You gift the 2 million today, you are certain because there's a rev ruling or treasury regular rev ruling, right, Ann? That
Yep.
says we can't claw back. So you have certainty in the gift. You have to really live past 95 to think how both spouses live past 95, or the second death be past 95, to create the same certainty that an insurance would. The return, consecutive returns and sequential returns will matter. No major market corrections near death. Capital gains tax rates don't rise. You really have a lot less certainty when you're not using insurance in the estate planning situation, when you're using the leverage of a well-structured second to die contract.
Yep.
And you can see the benefits of strategy 3, that also is, if something happens early on, you've got a massive advantage, less dependence on market performance. And by the way, the numbers here work really well. I mean, there's great products second to die that are vanilla universal life contracts. There are great index universal life contracts with long dated guarantees. And there are a number of variable life contracts second to die that also have long dated guarantees. And I think you guys have at
Yes.
least 2 of those, right?
Yep.
IUL, VUL.
Yep.
So, there's a lot of good product out there in the market, Securin being one of them. But this, again, this to me is a no-brainer. And if you have clients, let's not just think about clients that have gifted the 28 million already. This works for any client that still has any amount of gifting left that they haven't already used. And if they've got the assets, back to Ann's kind of second or third slide, if they have the assets and you have done a financial plan for your clients, and you see that they have plenty of assets or excess assets, plenty of assets to live on during their retirement and until death, and they're legacy minded, that they want to make sure that their kids are well taken care of, and grandkids and multi-generational planning, using insurance is a no-brainer in my mind.
Yep.
So let's go ahead, Ian.
Yeah, I was going to say, I think, one of the things when you look at holistic planning, generally, you can always say, well, at this point, there's a break even, or, this could happen. But what you're really doing here is capitalizing on that certainty. You're using a carrier partner kind of alongside that client's portfolio to say, I can set it and forget it, right? We've addressed this need, and I don't have to worry about managing the portfolio to this point until 95 to get to that break even point. That's a lot harder, and we don't have the certainty. If we knew when people were going to pass away, or when they were going to, how long they were going to live, we obviously would be very quick out of a job, right? So it's just a matter of really using that certainty to give the client the peace of mind to say, like, I've done my estate plan. I have liquidity for the future. I don't have to wait to see how my investments do and kind of what happens long term, because you've done it on day one. So
Yeah.
I think that is the type of strategy that clients like, because then they can enjoy life, right? They don't have to watch, every penny, and they can just, go on vacation, have fun, enjoy their family, and know that they've set aside this money for their family to pay potential estate taxes, and they're not worried about, the IRS or the state they live in coming in and taking a big cut of that. So,
Yeah. Within the context of that, I've heard some people say it's a permission slip to spend
yep,
and have an a joyful retirement
right.
year. So,
It's
because
true
you've kind of done
freedom.
all the planning, right?
Yep,
So I think that, your client's decision, we've kind of touched on this, and this is numbers at age 85. We looked at it 17.2 million at 85, 23 or 29. I don't know. If I was the client, I think I know what my decision would be.
right.
I don't know that I want to take that 30-year bet. These clients were 60 and 58. So that's a 35-year runway for them. And it's a meaningful long-term bet.
Yep,
So let's kind of, for everybody on the call, last slide is kind of what can you do today, right? So ask your clients, have they already used some of their gifting? If they've used all of it, good news is they have 2 million more. If they haven't used any of it, good news is they have 30 million to give. Assuming they've got, that kind of an estate. But there's no wrong answer to making a gift today if you've done a financial plan and if you don't need the money for lifestyle on a forward basis, right? Full stop. If they can't do it, don't even talk about it. Run this analysis. We can run it for you. We've got the three strategy comparison. We can run numbers and let the math drive the conversation. Coordinate with our team, coordinate with the CPA or with the attorneys for the client. We can help prepare for that and then present all three options. And then, we get into underwriting and executing gifts and filing gift tax returns and so on and so forth. So, great opportunity. And again, very, very timely. OBBA is now, 6 months and 11 days old. I think there's a lot of people that still have not made any real decisions about what to do with their extra $2 million gifting or any gifting if they haven't already made gifts. And there's just massive amounts of leverage in this. So we will take some questions. I think there's a last slide and just disclosures and so on and so forth. But I think that open for questions. There is one real quick, and Victor, you asked if we used whole life or IUL. I don't remember. I think it was not whole life. It was a universal life chassis. What I can't tell you if it was VUL, IUL, or UL. But the reality is it doesn't much matter. If it was almost 12 million or 11.5 million or 12.5 million, depending on the carrier and the product and the assumptions that you use, it's still going to be a win because those crossover points don't happen until way, way out in life with
yep,
new products, right? Whole life
yep,
behaves a little differently. It may start lower and grow, with dividend additions and so on at later years. So that might provide some benefit, but I'm not taking a product position on this webinar and certainly in this analysis.
yep.
Any other questions, please put them into the Q&A box. I think we may have another one, and give me a second.
Sure.
Thank you for sharing. Thank you for being with us, Amit. Appreciate your time. And any final parting words on this opportunity and what we should be looking for?
Yeah, I think this is an ongoing conversation. I think we looked at that snapshot of just the 2 million. So looking at those numbers, it was exponentially more favorable with using life insurance as that asset. So imagine a client who hasn't done planning and can look at gifting 30 million instead of, the 2 or 4 million that a married couple might have depending on their situation. But I think it's something to watch too. One Big Beautiful Bill Act made that $15 million exemption permanent in 2026, but we're going to continue to see that index for inflation as we go forward. So there's continued opportunities here as
Yeah,
long as that, bill exists and there's no changes in Congress to continue to capitalize on this gifting capacity that we've never seen before. We've never had quite this
yeah.
favorable of gifting capacity in history. And there's just tons of opportunity here. So,
Yeah, we are in the heyday of estate
yeah,
planning. I really believe that. And you mentioned just the last thing, and then we'll wrap up here. You mentioned future indexing. We have
yep,
had a number of cases where we have projected forward indexing on top of the 30 million with gifts. So just think about it. If you have another 2.5% on $30 million of exemption, what's that? 500, $450,000 of extra
Yep.
gifting next year. And then it goes up the year after that, goes up the year after that. So assuming OBBBA stays in place for a while, we will continue to have pretty meaningful gifting opportunities on a forward basis. And we also have a model that projects those additional index increases in the gifting to model out insurance to do that. The danger there, of course, is what happens if legislation changes. And we've modeled an insurance policy with future gifts because of the exemption, and the exemption gifting is not available because it
Yep.
didn't index up. So got to be careful with that. But great opportunities for us today. I think I've got another question, and let me
Yeah.
see. I've got a wow, this is a long one. It says I may have missed this, but why do both have to live to 95 and strategy two be needed to come close to strategy three? Um, Steve, it's a pretty long question here, so I'm going to give you the quick answer. So at the end of the day, the the assets are growing at 7%. The insurance, as we all know, is a 6.5% asset. So eventually you're going to have that crossover point. In the example that we used, the crossover point was somewhere around 96. But that is simply because we were using a 7% sequential return on the asset growth and then the taxes. So I'm happy to share our numbers. Yeah, right there. Thank you, Ann. So I'm happy to share the spreadsheet with you and the details, and we can take it offline. Okay, I wait. There might be another question. Nope. I think we are good.
All right.
On behalf of Securian and SPG, we are grateful for you guys being on the call with us today. And I want to thank you personally for joining me on this webinar.
It's
Appreciate
my
your
pleasure. Thank
expertise.
you.
And we look forward to seeing you all in a month. We are doing the next one late July. I think it's the 25th of July. We will be communicating the topic and the date and time of that webinar in short order. So again, thank you very much for joining us. Have a great rest of your week. Thank you, Ann.
Yep. Awesome. Thank you so
Bye-bye.
much.